Good afternoon, my name's Alistair McLean. I'm the CEO of TEQSA, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on the transition to increased cost recovery. In doing so, I'd like to introduce our Executive Director of Regulatory Operations, Dr. Mary Russell, and also Katrina Quinn, our Director of Policy, Research and Engagement, and Katrina will be moderating the question and answer section of today's meeting. Before I do commence though, I acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and for today's meeting and their continuing connection to land, waters and community, and take this opportunity to pay our respects to country and to elders past, present and emerging. Before I commence today's presentation, I'd just make a few opening remarks. Firstly, today's webinar will be about 20 minutes presentation from myself and Mary, and followed by a Q&A to balance out the hour that we've scheduled. Don't forget to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and Katrina will be moderating that and facilitating that discussion. About 200 people have registered for today's event, so we ask that you keep that in mind in preparing your questions and your expectations of our responses. Today's webinar is being recorded and transcribed, with both the recording and the transcription to be made available on our website as soon as we possibly can, both for your subsequent reference and for anyone who has not been able to participate in today's meeting. I'll get onto a formal slide-driven presentation, if you like, shortly, but I'd just like to make a few general points, which I'm hoping, based on the initial responses we've had to the release of the Cost Recovery Implementation Statement, will address at least some basic concerns or questions. The first is that the monies that TEQSA collects through cost recovery are not for TEQSA. They go to consolidated revenue, or Commonwealth's consolidated revenue accounts, and so we are not, as TEQSA, dependent on the monies that we receive from cost recovery for our regulatory activity. So that's the first very important point. The second broad observation is that cost recovery by regulators from regulated entities is long established policy and practice of successive governments, and this government has taken the decision to approve the Cost Recovery Implementation Statement for implementation from the 1st of January. The third is the link between our service levels and our charges, with calls last week, for example, from peak bodies for a service charter to accompany cost recovery. Just note that TEQSA has an existing service charter, and that's available on our website at teqsa.gov.au/service charter. And as many of you are aware, we are working to remodel our regulatory practice, for example, in combining our assessments of re-registration and self-accrediting authority. And as we adapt our model and our processes, in particular the shift to a more risk-based model, we will reflect those changes in our cost recovery implementation statement. And we're very open to revising our service charter to accompany a revised CRIS, or Cost Recovery Implementation Statement as we know it, once we've taken our first consultation during the course of 2023. And we expect that at this stage to be during the third quarter. Today, a final point really is we'll only be able to address a number of specific questions and concerns in relation to ESOS, CRICOS, once we have developed and had the Minister approve a fee instrument, and once we've issued accompanying charging regulation and guidelines. So those documents, which are an important part of the process in setting up ourselves for cost recovery, are still in train, and we expect those to be finalised in the next 2 to 3 weeks, and by mid-November to have more complete information available to the sector to enable your planning for next year. And finally, I ask that you submit your questions on the chat available to us all today. Again, there are around 200 people attending, so that we can collate and moderate these through the Q&A discussion. And again, this webinar is being recorded and transcribed. On to the presentation proper. From the 1st of January 2023, we'll begin implementing increased cost recovery in accordance with the Australian Government charging framework. That will implement the Australian Government's initial decision to increase, or the former government's initial decision to increase cost recovery, which was in the 2018-19 budget, but that was subsequently delayed, firstly for further consultation with the sector, and then subsequently because of the impacts of the pandemic and as part of overall fee relief and waivers for the sector. This change, which will be phased in over 3 years, brings us into line with other Australian regulatory agencies that recover the cost of the services from the entities that they regulate. And to support the change, a cost recovery implementation statement has been developed, and it's been approved by both the Minister of Education and the Minister of Finance in the last couple of months. This statement outlines the new fees and the charges for the agency, incorporating feedback from the sector following a consultation that we held a little bit over a year ago on a previous draft of the CRIS, and the new CRIS was released 2 weeks ago or so on the 13th of October through letters to all providers and information on our website and accompanying social media channels. It's really important to note that the CRIS is not a constant. It's subject to consultation and adjustment and amendment each year of its existence. So we intend, after the first 8 or 9 months of operation of the scheme, to consult closely with the sector and to release further amendments to the CRIS in around about this time next year. And that's a really important point. We recognise that this is not a perfect beast, so to speak. There will be issues that arise, and both for us and for providers, and we commit ourselves to working with you through the course of 2023. Just on to the basic structure of the CRIS. At the moment, we recover about 15% of our regulatory and quality assurance costs. So that's a 15% of about $16 million. When the phase transition of CRIS is complete in 2025, we'll recover around 90% of the costs of our regulatory and quality assurance activities. And we do that through 2 basic mechanisms. The first is a registered higher education provider charge, and that comprises itself 2 components, and I'll come to those in a moment. And the second component of the overall scheme are application-based fees. So there's charges, both in relation to our sector-wide activity through an annual registration charge. Then there are charges for our compliance and risk-related activity that is applicable to individual providers. And the other one is application-based fees, and we'll come to that in a moment as well. So the first component, the so-called registered higher education provider charge. As outlined in the CRIS, from the 1st of January 2023, we are introducing this charge, and it will be billed to providers annually. It incorporates 2 things: an annual registration charge for all providers and any additional charges for individual providers as a result of compliance activities that we might undertake in relation to those providers during the course of 2023. The annual registration charge for 2023 will be 20% of the full charge. It will increase to 50% the year after, and then from the 1st of January 2025, the annual registration charge will be at 100%. The cost recovery, it's important to note here that the cost recovery model is based on regulatory effort or activity rather than provider size, and the annual registration charge covers those indirect costs for regulatory activities that can't be attributed to single providers that apply for our across the sector, such as our guidance notes, etc., and that apply to all providers. Again, once the phase-in period is complete, there'll be no discounts on the annual registration charge. Providers will only be charged in relation to the monitoring of conditions and voluntary undertakings for the period commencing from the 1st of 2023. If you have conditions in place now, you won't be charged for the activity that's taking place now. Providers will not be charged in 2023 for conditions or voluntary undertakings that are already in place. So, for clarity, the invoices that we'll be issuing in early 2023 for the registered higher education provider charge will only be for the annual registration charge component. Those activities that we undertake during 2023 in relation to individual providers, you'll receive an invoice for that activity in 2024. So again, we can address that more specifically in the questions and answers, but I want to try to make clear now is that the first bill will be 20% of a component of the registered higher education provider charge, and then 50 and then 100% in the following years. Again, it's important to note that our sector consultation in 2021 gathered some important feedback from providers, and that's directly influenced the CRIS that's now been approved. The main difference is for the most part, dropping the hourly charging component that was in the previous draft. So this CRIS adopts, for one thing, a two-tiered approach to re-registration application costs based on what our practice of core and core plus assessments for re-registration. It implements set charges for compliance assessments rather than hourly charges, and it implements set charges for conditions monitoring associated with either your registration as a provider or on the courses that have been accredited to you, for you as a provider. So our view is that these charges will broadly support greater transparency for providers in understanding our fees and charges, and again, we're sure that that will be the subject of pretty robust discussion during the course of next year and will very much influence the review and the subsequent iterations of the cost recovery implementation statement. Again, these funds go to Commonwealth consolidated revenue, not to TEQSA. So that's an important point to make. The other component, you'll recall the initial slide or the early slide, which was twofold, an RHEP and then application-based fees. As outlined in the CRIS, the application-based fees are the other avenue for TEQSA to recover our costs. We'll resume charging application fees from the 1st of January 2023. They'll be payable by providers for each application they make to TEQSA. Applications for registration, initial registration, applications for re-registration, applications for accrediting courses, and applications for re-accrediting courses. And that fee schedule is set out in the CRIS and will also be available on our website. The billing for applications accepted before 1st of January 2023 is an important question that we know has been asked of us. Providers will pay fees based on when an application for re-registration or re-accreditation is accepted by TEQSA as valid. Where a provider makes an application that's accepted in TEQSA in 2022, you'll pay the fees that apply now, not the fees that apply after the 1st of January. And then for applications that are accepted post 1st of January, the new charging regime or the fee regime for those applications will apply. So there's a bit of a transition period between now and the 1st of January, and we might want to make as clear as possible how we're going to be treating those applications for providers. You'll note from the table on the screen before you at the moment, or the slide shot, that one feature of the regime for fees is that discounts will apply to the accreditation and re-accreditation of courses, and that's based on provider size, and the proxy for provider size is ETSL. So if you're a provider of more than 5,000 students, there is no discount, and ranging down to providers with less than 500 students will receive a 70% discount on those application fees. I'll pass to Dr. Russell now to speak to the implementation of the scheme and a bit of a timeline.
Thank you. So at the moment our TEQSA staff are really deep into the work of preparing for the implementation of cost recovery. That's, as you can imagine, resulting in quite a lot of updating of work around our processes and our systems to support a transition that will be as seamless as possible for you. As part of that work, we're developing two really important instruments. The first is a fee instrument which sets out TEQSA's application-based fees, and that relates to detail in Part 3 of the Cost Recovery Implementation Statement. The other is a charging regulation which sets out how the registered higher education provider charge will be calculated in relation to each of our providers. So the reason I'm mentioning that these are still in development is that until they are finalised and signed off, we won't be able to publish those. But as soon as they are available, we will be letting you know via email and also putting them on the web so that you can access that additional level of detail. We'll also be responding to queries about the cost recovery statement via a dedicated email address that we'll give you today, and we are asking people to send those inquiries through to us at a special email address so that we can actually manage those and keep them updated and give you the most current information possible on the web. So there's a lot of change that this will bring, particularly in the first 12 months of cost recovery transition. I guess to call out some of the key changes and dates, from the 1st of January we'll begin transitioning to increased cost recovery. What that will mean is that the fee waivers that have been in place will end, and TEQSA will recommence charging for regulatory fees for activities including renewals of registration, course accreditation, re-accreditation. We expect to issue invoices to providers relating to the registered higher education provider charge for the first time in early 2023. As Alistair said, we will be having an annual cycle of review and update to the cost recovery implementation statement and the associated documents. So there'll be an opportunity during the year for the sector to provide further feedback as part of that. Further information about the cost recovery, including answers to frequently asked questions, will be available on the website, and as I said before, we'll continue to update that for you. So before we go to questions, I'll just share with you two important bits of information. The first is where you can find detail of the information about cost recovery on our website, including access to frequently asked questions. But at the bottom you'll see the dedicated email address for cost recovery, so it's costrecovery@teqsa.gov.au. We do ask that if you have questions about cost recovery, your first port of call is the information on the website and the frequently asked questions. Yeah. If you find that your question isn't answered in those materials, please submit a question to us via that email address rather than by an individual request to your case manager at this stage. So, thank you for your attention as we step through that. We look forward to answering some of your questions now, and we'll turn to Katrina to get us started.
Thank you. So we might kick off with a question that came through through the registration process for this webinar. So the question is there a risk that institutions will be reluctant to voluntarily disclose compliance breaches, given there will now be a charge associated with investigations and compliance assessments by TEQSA, that is, penalising open, honest discourses? I might get you to answer that one in first instance, Mary.
Sure. So look, I understand where that question comes from, but the obligations on providers under under the Higher Education Standards Framework remain unchanged by cost recovery. And in addition to recognising that these things are in place to ensure quality and the reputation of our sector, what I will say is that the structure of cost recovery really does support and should encourage all of you as providers in being as transparent and proactive as possible in letting us know about problems. We've been asked some questions about the charge for compliance assessments. And it's really important to note that a compliance assessment is never commenced without a detailed preliminary assessment. And this is your opportunity where there is an issue of concern that's raised with TEQSA or by a compliance breach, to provide as much relevant information as possible in a really timely manner. And in many instances, we know from experience that that will be enough to address and answer our concerns, and it won't be necessary to move forward to a compliance assessment. So I would really encourage you to be on the front foot, be transparent and timely in sharing information with us.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So we've received many questions with regards to CRICOS, quite specific questions. I just thought it might be an opportunity just to clarify what we can and our position in regards to CRICOS and the CRIS at the moment.
So there's a lot we can't say today about what it will mean in terms of specific charges for CRICOS related activities. As you'd be well aware, there's quite a lot of detail in relation to CRICOS that differs from non-CRICOS activity. That's currently being worked through in the fee instrument and the regulatory charging instrument. And as soon as that detail is there, we'll share that with you. I don't want to share that incorrectly or prematurely until that's been finalised and signed off. So I do apologise that that's one of the areas where we're not going to be able to settle all of your questions today. But please do email those through and we will make sure that we deal with them as soon as we're able to in the frequently asked questions.
I think that also reflects what we quite frankly need to acknowledge here is that it's been quite a compressed time period. The fact that the election was held in May, a new government was elected, it had to settle in, make various considerations and come about to addressing some of the decisions by the previous government. And so we've got a quite compressed period that's on at the moment in terms of having the CRIS formally approved, releasing it, and then following it up with the instruments, regulation and guidelines. So we're not going to hide from the fact that it's quite a compressed period, and what we'll be endeavouring to do is have those guidelines and regulation and fee instrument approved and released over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and then by mid to late November being in a position to fully advise the sector about the detail around invoicing, charging, and the multiple activities associated with different components of the regime.
Great. Now we have a question here with regards to the service charter. Pleased that there is one available, but how moving forward will TEQSA ensure that there is value for money? So that's one part of the question. And the second part of the question is around ensuring transparency of processes to address concerns, issues or complaints regarding service quality. Alistair?
Well, again, we have a service charter in place. I think that increased cost recovery actually presents an opportunity both for us and for the sector to more transparently, if you like, share with the sector the nature of our activities, the costs associated with them, and the manner in which those activities are charged to the sector. So whilst some see increased cost recovery as a particular burden, I think it really does offer some opportunities, and we'll be looking very much to the lessons learned from the first 6 to 9 months of experience with cost recovery. It's very new for this agency, as it is for you as providers, and then engaging in a consultation with providers next year with a view to an amended CRIS that will reflect, I trust, a much greater understanding on part both of TEQSA and providers about where our costs lie and how they're attributed, and then how they're charged to the sector.
Okay. Mary, I might direct this next question to you. If a new course application is lodged in 2022, will it incur charges for a substantive assessment which may occur in 2023?
Okay, so where an application is lodged in 2022, we will review it. We're experiencing really high demand at the present time. So it may be, in some instances, that preliminary assessment of the application doesn't occur until sometime in early 2023. However, if it was lodged in 2022 and it's assessed as being valid, the 2022 charging arrangements will apply. If an application submitted in 2022 is assessed as not being valid and therefore is not accepted for processing and needs to be resubmitted in 2023, then the 2023 arrangements would apply. So for the example that you raised, Katrina, if that application is lodged and valid in 2022, even though the substantive assessment may take place in 2023, the 2022 charging arrangements would apply.
Okay, thank you. So this one is with regards to the EPSL discount. Does the EPSL discount apply to registration and re-registration charges, or only to course accreditation and re-accreditation charges? I might leave this one with you as well, Mary.
Look, I stand to be corrected, but my understanding on that is that it relates to course accreditation and re-accreditation charges only.
Course re-accreditation charges and course accreditation charges.
Yes.
Thank you, just to clarify. Okay. We've received a question here around the costs received, are they paid to general revenue? And I think we covered that off earlier, that it goes to the Commonwealth Consolidated Revenue Fund. The monies collected do not come directly to TEQSA. So related to that is a question about details on the invoice, particularly what details will be included on the invoice, particularly in relation to variable costs.
Yeah, that's something we're working through at the moment. So in developing the guidelines, which we hope to issue by the end of late November, that will address questions about the structure and the content of invoicing and the timing of invoicing, the terms associated with invoicing. But I think it's reasonably clear that for that registered higher education provider charge, the first year it'll be quite a straightforward invoice. It'll be for the annual registration charge component of the RHEP, and no other charges will be made at that point, or invoiced, I should say. Subsequently, however, the invoicing will reflect both the standard registration charge, and then for those providers that have been the subject of conditions monitoring or a compliance assessment, etc., those additional charges will apply and will be set out in the invoice.
Okay, great. We have a question. Apologies, I missed it originally. It's been reposted again. So which application cost reference should be considered within the CRIS, Table 2 or Appendix A? Which is considered correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure where.
Which application cost reference should be considered correct within the CRIS, Table 2 or Appendix A?
Can we address that on our website shortly? I don't have the tables right in front of me right now, but
Sure.
I'm sure we'll be able to try and address that, or hopefully before the end of the meeting. But we might be able to circle back here, or else we definitely will.
Okay, so we have one of our colleagues messaged me, and it's Appendix A.
Right.
Okay. All right. Oh, the screen's a bit blocked. Okay. Mary, how will TEQSA charge a provider if re-accrediting more than one course at a time?
So the basic principle behind cost recovery is that it relates to the activity involved in managing that assessment. So if there is more than one course that needs to be reaccredited, then each course will incur a cost for reaccreditation because there's activity associated with each of them. So combining them into a single application won't affect that. The charges will be per course.
Okay. Just staying on the costs of annual re-registration. Alistair, I might throw to you on this one. When can we get the actual annual registration costs released? Is it 29,000, 32,000 or somewhere in between? Because currently it's an estimated cost.
Yeah, it's an estimated cost of between 29,000 and 32,000. There's a small component of that activity which is reflects when we're treating concerns and complaints made to TEQSA. So that's the reason for the slight variation there. So the ARC will be around about $30,000 under the current financial year calculation, and of course it'll be charged in 2023 at 20%. So each provider should expect to receive an invoice in January for around about $6,000. Okay. And that $6,000, just to clarify, that will be the total of the RHEP, the Registered Higher Education Provider charge, for 2023. It's only in 2024 that there'll be additional items for some providers based on compliance-related activity undertaken by TEQSA. With respect to those providers, there'll be a range of potential additional charges there as part of that RHEP invoice.
Okay. Now I'll encourage our participants to send in some more questions. So this is the last one that I have to ask, unless there's others that come through in the meantime. So get your fingers busy on your keyboards. So why was the annual registration charge not adjusted according to the size of the provider's student load?
The cost recovery guidelines and framework and this applies to across the economy, if you like. It applies to all regulators who are now taking up cost recovery. It needs to be in relation to regulatory effort or activity. So to provide any differentiation based on provider size for the annual registration charge would represent a form of cross-subsidy across the sector, and that's not permitted under the cost recovery guidelines or framework, and it's principally because it would then resemble a tax. So that's principally the reason for that. To the extent that we've been able, we have worked in discounts for a particular component of application-based fees, and that's in relation to accreditation and reaccreditation, recognising the impacts on the smallest providers in particular. But that's almost an exception to the rule, if you like. So that rule is not otherwise applied to other components of the charging regime.
Okay, thank you, Alistair. Mary, can you clarify what a compliance assessment is? It's mentioned in Appendix B with a cost of $36,000.
Okay, so a compliance assessment is an activity that is generally not initiated by a provider. It's usually undertaken in response to a concern that is raised with TEQSA or a concern that we form ourselves. And it relates to, they can relate to a range of aspects in which a provider is believed possibly to not be complying with the standards. There's normally a two-step process around a compliance assessment. So the first step, as I mentioned before, is a preliminary assessment. A preliminary assessment is not charged. It's the stage of managing the matter where we do as much work as we can to scope it, to understand the dimensions and the nature of the concerns, and to understand what information is available at that time. And it's almost universally, providers have the opportunity at that stage to share information with us. So to speak to us about the concerns, to provide any additional information that you hold about those concerns, and particularly to provide us with information about what you may already have done in relation to those concerns. It's only after we've done that preliminary assessment that we would consider whether or not a more extensive compliance assessment is required. And it's only if a decision is taken by the Commission or a delegate to move a matter into a formal compliance assessment that a charge is incurred. So as I said before, it does make that preliminary assessment stage a really important opportunity to be as timely and open and transparent with the information that you provide to us as possible, so that we can make the most complete and accurate assessment possible around those concerns.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Can we have a question here? It is about CRICOS and noting that there are some limits to what we can say about CRICOS. But can we comment on whether CRICOS fees are anticipated for providers with self-accrediting authority? Just hoping to clarify, because there's some varying interpretations of the cost recovery implementation statement internally at this particular provider.
Look, as with other questions about CRICOS at the moment, we will take that on notice and make sure that we issue some very clear language around that in the frequently asked questions.
Yeah, and that's there was another reposting of a CRICOS question around the CRICOS variation, so that's part of that whole holding statement conversation. Will come back to the sector in hopefully in a few weeks. We have a question. Just getting back to your point, Alistair, when you made about the accounting for the size of a provider, just building on from that, is there consideration of a differential pricing for not-for-profits or charities compared to for-profit providers, which is different to the size cross-subsidy matter that you mentioned?
No, the blunt answer to that is there's not provision for the category, if you like, of provider based on tax treatment or charitable status, etc. The only differentiation that we make in the cost recovery scheme as it's currently set up and will apply next year is through course accreditation fees based on the size proxy being ETHSL. So no, it does not make allowances for or distinguish between different types of providers.
Okay, thank you. Well, there's certainly an appetite for more information about CRICOS, and I just want to acknowledge that here. We have some people reposting their questions and hoping to find out more. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, and that just asking for a little bit more patience for a couple more weeks, and we'll certainly answer all these questions. We totally get those concerns.
Yep. A lot of this is a pretty careful interpretation of the intersection of the ESOS Act with the TEQSA Act, etc. So, and what we're able to charge for around applications and non-applications. So we're just getting that clarity at the moment in finalising a fee instrument. And subsequently the charging regulation, and then we expect to be in a position to advise the sector more fully. Okay,
thank you. Mary, we have an interesting question here around course reaccreditation. So will the provider be charged $21,710 per course, in brackets, no nested program? So I guess this is the wanting to clarify the reaccreditation of a course without nested programs or with nested programs, and what happens there. Good question. Okay,
we have identified that there's we need to specifically consider any differences around the activity for nested programs. So I'm going to once again say we will check the latest position on that, and we'll post that to the website as part of the frequently asked questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Mary, I will stay with you. What is the difference between re-registration renewal and self-accreditation core plus? There's this, for the amount of $116,400, and re-registration renewal Core Plus.
Okay.
Of 102,100.
Look, it's helpful to have an opportunity to clarify this, and we've also had questions from some self-accrediting providers about whether they have to pay an SAA fee as part of the re-registration. That's not the case. So as part of our regulatory improvement work, we've recently looked at how we can actually streamline and make more timely and more cost-effective the process of applying for self-accrediting authority status for those providers who don't currently hold that and who wish to apply for limited or full self-accrediting authority. As part of that work, we identified that a lot of the information that's required for that assessment is the same or very similar as the information that is required for a re-registration assessment. So for those providers who wish to make that application, we now can align those processes and do those two assessments concurrently. It's, I think, particularly advantageous. It reduces the burden on providers to provide really extensive information that might otherwise be duplicative, and it also means that we can manage that much more efficiently. So the combination of a re-registration charge and an SAA charge will only apply for a provider if at that time they're applying to do both those things, to re-register and to apply for self-accrediting authority status. The difference between re-registration charges that are Core or Core Plus is determined by a number of factors that we assess from the data that we hold and consider during the scoping stage for re-registration. And the difference in cost for those reflects the fact that the extent and type of information and the assessment activity differs for Core and Core Plus re-reg applications.
Great, thank you. So a question here, asking if we could contact providers when we have a full response to our CRICOS questions. I suggest the answer would be yes, and we'll actually announce it through various channels and have it up on our website as well.
Yes.
So thank you for that point, Rachel, who sent that in. There is a question here with just wanting clarity around the EPSL discount. The discount to accreditation, re-accreditation, the percentage discount, whether or not that is applied based on a provider's overall EPSL and not the EPSL for the course being re-accredited.
I'd like to be able to answer that now.
I'm pretty sure we'll confirm that it's on the overall EPSL.
Good question, however.
The size of the provider and the proxy is the overall EPSL.
Yeah, I'm
but
not sure.
We'll confirm that, yeah.
We'll confirm that for you.
Okay.
Part of Mary's earlier point relates to some of the complexity in the design of the cost recovery implementation statement. And what we've done is recognise that the load for the agency varies every year. You'll recall that our legislation requires us to at least once every 7 years either register or re-register or a provider, or re-accredit the courses that are offered by those providers in the cases of providers without self-accrediting authority. But the load each year varies substantially, and at the moment what we're dealing with is a very high load in response to the deferment of various processes through the pandemic, for example. But that 7-year cycle is what has led to our calculations of the cost. So the cost might not reflect activity in 1 year alone, but an average of the activity that we expect over 7 years. That can be difficult to predict. So it's something that might be the subject of discussions next year with the sector around our experience of the early stages of cost recovery, but that just sets a little bit more context for you, I hope.
Great. Okay, well, will we charge a cost as part of the provider's re-registration scoping statement? I'm not 100% sure. We might, Wing Chung, might just get you to flesh that question out for us a little bit so we can answer that. So the question was, will TEQSA provide a cost to providers as part of the higher education provider re-registration scoping statement? I don't know if that was part of an initial re-registration scoping, or?
No, I think that question relates to the fact that we undertake that re-registration activity in stages of activity.
Right.
Now, we will double check that and clarify it on the FAQs, but my understanding is that the charge isn't incurred during scoping. It relates to the re-registration application being finalised and accepted by TEQSA.
Great, okay, thank you. And just clarifying, the re-registration charge, it's applicable for every 7 years, and is CRICOS re-registration required annually?
So the re-registration charge relates to the activity of a re-registration. While the normal period for re-registration is 7 years, that's not always the case. So it relates to the activity each and every time a provider needs to undergo re-registration.
Great.
What was the second part of the question, Katrina?
I think you answered it, Mary. It was to do with CRICOS as well, so I think the same principle applies, that it's in relation to the activity.
Because some registration periods, of course, are less than 7 years, and often a re-registration can result in the agreement to continue the registration, but for a shortened period for a number of reasons. And that can be with, for example, a number of conditions that might be applied on that registration. So for different providers with different regulatory history and risk levels, etc., the re-registration can be shorter. The span can be shorter than 7 years, but the legislation provides at least for at least once every 7 years.
Okay.
Yep.
So that question was a good segue into this next one. Alistair, well, the camera is on you. Is a re-registration fee charged in the year the application is submitted or the year in which the decision is made? So I guess this gets back to how we invoice when and where. And
Yeah, it'll relate to the year in which the activity associated with that takes place. Although, no, that's a fee, isn't it, for an application for re-registration payable upon application for re-registration.
Yes.
So again, there's a distinction between the charges in the
Yep.
system and the fees. So the fees are application based, and for the most part they're up front,
Yep.
and the charges are non-application based, and with the exception of the annual registration charge, are paid mostly in arrears. Yep.
great. And we have clarification with regards to the EPSL and the discount. It's the total. It's based on the total EPSL of the provider, not the EPSL of the course.
There you go.
Thank you. So then we have our, and we might wrap it up after this question. We have 10 minutes to go, and just so you can have some time for some closing comments, Alistair and Mary. Would you please confirm the annual registration fee for 2023 is 20% of 29,000 approximately? It's slightly confusing that Appendix B, it lists charges from 2023 and has the ARC, annual registration charge, at 29,000.
Yeah, but with the discount to be applied next year at 20% of around 29,000. It's between 29 and 32, so it'll be approximately $6,000 for each provider.
Okay, thank you, Alistair. Thank you for everyone sending your questions in. Just to clarify, anything that we haven't been able to answer fully here, we'll update our FAQs, and also if you have any burning questions that you didn't get a chance to answer here, please send them through to our cost recovery email. And I'll hand it back over to Alistair and Mary.
Mary, is there anything you'd like to say before we...
One thing I will add in anticipation of questions is that there are a small number of providers who have registrations, in particular with us at the moment, with conditions that we are reviewing to try and make sure that any conditions that are now redundant can be assessed and revoked where that's applicable before the end of this year, so that they won't incur a charge for the provider next year.
And my final comment would be along the lines of this is very new for TEQSA, despite the fact that the prospect of cost recovery has been with the agency and with the sector for 3 or 4 years now. It's also very new for the sector, and that's been made very clear to us, including through the consultations that we held in 2021 on a previous version of the CRIS. We did what we could as TEQSA to engage the Department of Finance, Department of Education on amendments to the CRIS that reflected the feedback from the sector. However, the framework and the guidelines for cost recovery impose a number of well-considered policy constraints on the design of the system, if you like, or the regime. So we were able to do away with hourly charging, with the exception of investigations, which I would note are extremely rare. And you'll see in the CRIS there's a $0 amount against investigations because we haven't actually done any. So that will continue to be, in the unlikely event that we would commence a formal investigation, there'll be an hourly charging regime. But for all other compliance-related activities, it's a set fee, set structured fee. And the $36,000 for a compliance assessment that was referenced earlier in the questioning is basically a breakdown of the history, our experience of compliance assessments against the overall cost that we could attribute to that activity. So that's how the design of the system works. So it's I don't expect that we won't have issues or problems or questions or little stumbles through the course of next year as we put this thing into place and as we receive your responses to it. And we really do want your responses to cost recovery, and we really do want to work with the sector very closely, especially around about the third quarter of calendar 2023, to engage in a consultation, to openly discuss any issues or problems that have arisen in the course of the first experience of cost recovery for us and the sector, and to use that information to put to the government an amended CRIS for approval by our Minister. And so I think there's as much an opportunity as there is a perceived burden out of cost recovery, especially over the long term, to discipline, both for us to discipline our activity and for the sector to see that discipline being applied in our activity and how it's costed and then attributed through our invoicing of the sector. So we really look forward to having that opportunity to work with you. I don't say that lightly or without genuine intent. And with that, I think we just make that commitment to continue working with you as providers in making the cost recovery system work as effectively as possible. So with that, again, for further information, go to our website /cost recovery or address specific questions to cost recovery at TEQSA, etc. And we'll do our best to answer your questions and concerns. And then also to foreshadow the completion of our fee instrument, which is in draft form at this stage and needs to go to the government for approval, the completion of a charging regulation, and then the issue of guidelines around the entire regime, which will set out some of the detail, for example, around invoices and how they will look and how they'll be structured and the terms of that invoicing. So there's a little bit of distance to go, but we're hoping today's presentation has given you some clarity around what we will be implementing from the 1st of January, and we again look forward to working with you and answering your questions. Thanks very much.